Anyway, so this proliferation of negotiations means you either have to have a really, really large diplomatic corps, which we don't, or you have to really be exceptionally organized. The way multilateral negotiations are evolving in terms of the sheer volume of issues that need to be negotiated and debated means that the whole game plays into the hands of very well-resourced countries. And so countries such as Kenya are going to have to figure out a different way of structuring our diplomatic corps to allow us to have a better understanding of what are the negotiations that are completely critical to us and which ones are less so. I believe that the sort of reforms that are possible now under Ambassador Amina, the new cabinet secretary, and the real sense of the need for transformative agenda may turn out with new ideas about how to approach these issues. None of these ideas, I've heard ideas being bandied about, but none of them is at a solid enough stage to even talk about. But we're going to need somehow with scholars, people who have been studying diplomacy for a long time, to really craft new ways. We may need to use our diaspora in a different way. We may need to have temporary diplomats. Somebody who lives in Japan, who's an environmentalist, who goes to New York, takes their vacation and represents us for a month after. I don't know, but somehow we have to figure out a way of doing this. And it's going to be very exciting to look forward to that. The other reason sometimes the African representation is weak is that even though Africa is really African countries are very different. Kenya is very different from other African countries and vice versa. And there are many African countries that are still very much in thrall, who very much follow a certain line laid out by certain countries. So why turn up if you know your negotiating position is already decided? And that's not just African countries, South American countries, Asian countries, those little islands all over the place, their votes are just rung in. And actually something I was going to say where I knew that I would really enjoy being a Kenyan civil servant was that when ultimately at that negotiation, just remember, when ultimately it came down to, okay, we just need to get like 5 people in the room so that we decide this thing. For the whole world, Kenya was there. It was America, it was the EU, it was the Japanese, it was the Chinese, but they couldn't leave Kenya out because of the various ways in which our delegation had acted, the fact that we're the headquarters of UNEP. So these things matter. So our representation varies because of our resources, others because of lack of interest, and also because of how we have a hard time prioritizing. Something may seem less important today, but it's actually the key to a much more important issue. The prioritization issue, we need a lot of work on it. Our sister from the Middle East, what country in the Middle East? That's Africa. It's just this little strip of ocean here. It's only the British who called it Middle East. Do you know where it's Middle East from? You know why there's a Middle East, a Near East, and a Far East? It's calculated from Greenwich in London, right? So when us guys say Middle East, what do we mean? Is it the middle of what East? So how do we deal with challenges like e-archives? I know at the mission we're starting one on a software called Podio. And it's a sort of combination between a database and a social media. So it sort of combines Facebook and a database. So I can upload something and write some comments that don't come on the document. And then somebody in Geneva can just log in and see, oh, Martin KImani said that this is where the negotiation ended. These are some of the things. Here are some of the countries that were with us on that. And then they can just continue where we left off in Nairobi. So we're going to be trying to pioneer this. We are calling it a proof of concept. So rather than trying to do a big plan for the ministry, we'll just do a small little plan for our mission. And if it works, maybe it'll be taken up by the entire ministry. The other question, and by the way, this issue of e-archives speaks to the need. There are phrases now that are coming up like e-diplomacy. You know, you find my fellow ambassadors, especially from the West, are on Twitter all the time. Me, I haven't dared go on Twitter because we don't have a clear understanding of how to use that tool and you know, effectively. So like now I should be tweeting with students at I don't know what, the hashtags and this kind of thing. So we don't have an understanding, but certainly there's something there about how we communicate to the public, because after all, our constitution does oblige us to be in communication with the Kenyan public. So how we're going to do that is really the question. And diplomacy has been very much a closed club. You know, you're guys, you've learned how to use all the forks. You know, you speak in a very particular way. You know, you have a lot of style, and you're cut off from everything. You know, a diplomat abroad sees the world from inside a car with tinted windows that drives you quietly from one place to the other. You know, and so this little closed club talks to itself. So even if I was to tell you what really, like if we're building a website, but we're asking what on that website could possibly be interesting. Because the really exciting things, I cannot put them there. I cannot put that I had a delegation tell someone, you better look for another job because your career is finished. Now that's exciting, but I can never put it there and say this representative of country X told a member of UNEP or Habitat XX in my hearing, because that's not right. So it'll be this boring. So we have to think of ways to communicate to the public. And so e-archives, using digital tools, it's all part of the same package. And indeed, if you do come into diplomacy with a better understanding of how to do these things, you'll find a lot of willing ears with time. What did it take to prepare those young diplomats I was talking about? The reason I appreciated them so much personally is because I've not always been a Kenyan government civil servant. I've spent most of my time outside of government, a substantial amount of it in the private sector. And so I had the stereotype of Kenyan government people that many Kenyans have. This bunch of, you know, corrupt, lazy people who just try and block everyone. Then to my incredible delight, I go in and I find extremely dedicated people who are busy trying to work in systems that have sometimes become bad because of the way the system is set up, but people who work exceptionally hard. And when people say Kenyans are cynical, I completely disagree, because you can complain as if you're cynical, but when you're put on the negotiating table and you're told you're now representing Kenya, and across the table is so and so, I tell you, all that, what you call cynicism, will just fly right out of you, because you will feel the pride and the understanding that what you're doing matters to people. Like if the UN can grow, I mean, if we can grow from 6,000 to 10,000 employees at the UN, there's no other single source of revenue as big that Governor Kidero will have in the next 5 years. None. Yeah. So it really does matter. And so in terms of the preparation, we had a series of meetings before to try and look at our negotiating position and try and fine-tune it, within the context of the Africa group especially, and try and make sure that the Africa group arrives at that negotiating table in a united fashion, as opposed to broken up in between ourselves because we don't agree with one another. And when you don't, you're picked off like a lion picking up off antelopes. You just cut one off and then you eat it. So we needed to be a herd that was bound by a common purpose. And the Kenyan purpose had to be explained and articulated in a way that made it a continental purpose. And that is not easy to do. And finally, of course, there were different diplomats with different roles in different rooms. And my job was to prowl around, getting advice from them on what to do next. And then finally, to talk to the technical experts at the Ministry of Environment on the particulars about issues around resolutions that had to do with technical detail. The final question was on how to balance between national interests and compromise during negotiations. I think this is an especially difficult thing. One is, you'll have heard this term, ambassador plenipotentiary. Have you heard that term? It's a fantastic term. When I saw it first on my documentation, I was like, wow, that sounds fantastic, but I didn't actually know exactly what it meant. Then I had to go and Google it. But what it is that I have the ability to make a deal at a conference that to a certain extent commits Kenya. Now that's a big responsibility. And this came from a time when ambassadors were representatives of kings, in a time when people used to ride carriages. It would take, how long to go from Brussels to Paris? 4 or 5 days? 3, 4 days, right? And so you didn't have time to call on your mobile and be like, okay, so this is their position now. What should I do, right? You had to be able to make a commitment at that particular time. And you can't always win all the battles. You have to compromise. So the ambassador sometimes is empowered to do that. Now, of course, there are limits. You can't say, oh, the ambassador plenipotentiary has declared war on the United States of America because he was sitting at a table somewhere and felt, no. There are limits, but there's something there about at the negotiating table, you're able to compromise and really stick by your word and know that it'll be supported, and that's very important. The other thing about this idea of compromise is the people who are sitting across from you, it's very important to know who they are. So for instance, at this last Habitat Governing Council, one of the delegations that was fighting us the hardest, and I use that word advisedly, fighting, but let's say debating us and negotiating with us the hardest, was led by someone from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, from their headquarters, from their capital city, who was senior in the ministry, but actually didn't have the ability to strike a deal. They had the ability, they had been told to come for one particular thing, and that was the thing they were going to go. Either they have it or they don't have it. And you could feel the rigidity and the inability to compromise, which was couched in a lot of fancy moral language about, this, we are reformers and want reform. But ultimately it was that I'm here and I'm not able to negotiate myself out of this situation. I can't compromise. And that weakened their position quite a bit, I thought. So there's a constant issue of compromise. Now, because negotiation is never done, the negotiating and advancing your national interest never stops. There are times when you compromise on something, but then you can advance it later. There are other times where compromise is not possible. Let me give you a very solid example. At the UN Habitat Conference, His Excellency President Uhuru, in his opening speech, commended UNEP for having taken universal governance, said that Kenya believes in the universal governance option. It thinks that in this day and age, this is the best way for global organizations to be governed. And that was now his opening remark. Now that right there put me in a steel cage, right? Because if the head of state has said that, and of course he said it because the Kenyan state, in his briefings and in his speech, this had been the position that had been taken. But because it's him who now said it, at the opening session, it created an immediate barrier. We now knew that was our red line. We could compromise all other kinds of things. But that one, we were going to even now go till 6 a.m. and completely disagree. Because, of course, at that governing council, things can go to a vote, but diplomats don't like voting. Yeah, they prefer consensus. And when you're defeated, when clearly the consensus is not with you, sometimes you give in to fight another day. So that created for us a very hard line that we had to keep. And what that meant is that there are countries that had come here determined to change the governing structure, and we completely refused. We said, you're going to have to wait till 2015, 2016 to revisit this question again. We're not going to agree. And in that way, our national interest at that point was not necessarily so much a national interest in that grand way, but it was a national position vis-a-vis a new head of state who'd made his first speech to the UN, and whose diplomacy has a great deal of desire to assert Kenyan strength and Kenyan capability on the international stage. So that was going to be something we had to stick to, come what may. So sometimes you can't compromise, but other times you can, and other times you just play a delaying game. Diplomats are fantastic at kicking the problem down the road for someone else to deal with it.
Okay, thank you very much, Bwana Ambassador, for really, as I said earlier on, a wonderful lecture. I'm sure that this has been a very, very useful afternoon for these young diplomats. Every year we have this kind of exercise, simulation of bilateral and multilateral negotiations. And we are really very, very happy that you are able to come this afternoon. I think listening to you, it's very clear that diplomacy is not just wearing nice suits and going to those cars and what have you. The issue is, what are you bringing home for the country economically? When you go to negotiate, can you be able to count the benefits that you are actually bringing as an ambassador? What can you say was your contribution for the 3 years you were there in London, New York, in Giri here, wherever? And the UNEP is actually a very, very good example of the link between diplomacy and economics, which is one of the national key areas of national interest. I always tell my students here that today's diplomat spends possibly more than 70% of his or her time on economic issues. Possibly more than that, but minimum 70%. And you can see the implications that UNEP, both the upgrading and the idea when the program came up. And George Moore tell me about the story of how the UNEP came up, the first program. It's really, it tells you a lot about personal commitment as an ambassador, with very clear focus on an issue where you have counted cost and benefits very well. I work with Michoke, who would always put his pen down and calculating how many jobs are we getting, what is this and this. This is the kind of mind you need in today's diplomat. It's not just enjoying yourself, going to the dinners and what have you. Well, those are necessary, I think, as he has said. But it is really, when you bring a program here that is the first major foreign exchange earner for the country, you have done something. You deserve to be given national knighthood and whatever, because you have done something major in whatever year. As he said, if you are to remove UNEP here, which was actually under major threat during the post-election violence, the implications would be unthinkable in the terms of economic impact on the Kenyan economy. So when we do our small CSRs here, politics and what have you, without implications, knowing the implications of what we are saying, even when we are disagreeing as country or whatever, really we have no idea of the key economic implications. So I'm very happy about the example here. It's a major issue, and it's an outcome of negotiations. So that you know negotiations is not like this simulation exercise where, okay, it is important that part of running, the tools of being a diplomat. But it's not much at stake for you. When you are negotiating, is something much more serious for the country, for your career as such. And I think the story that he has given is very, very important. I hope that one day that the story will be possibly properly written for wider circulation. That the story of Kenya's diplomacy, you know, we have a lot of critics here who say Kenya doesn't have any foreign policy. Kenya doesn't have this. I think we are very happy in criticizing ourselves, sometimes even without asking what do we exactly mean. And I think what Dr. KImani is saying is really a very articulated type of diplomatic engagement, very focused, very focused. And this is what we want you to be. As in diplomats for the countries represented here, you have a very major role to play. And I'm happy that now in Kenya we are giving our diplomats a performance contract. So at the end of the year, what are those targets that you have been able to achieve? Something that you have signed, that these are my targets that I'm going to achieve. But you need to go beyond those. Sometimes some of us make very simple targets that you can easily achieve. But the issue is how the little issues that matter. Negotiating that upgrading of UNEP and many other things. Every day, in every zone, every sector, there are those major deals. And these are the ones that come out of the multilateral negotiations and the bilateral negotiations. So it's not just really an exercise of talking, but you can count either in the short term and the long term, the benefits that derive from that. So I want to thank you very much for bringing home this and for your commitment. And that you are bringing up very good young diplomats. I want you to be very happy to really to see whether we can be able to have you more and more, possibly give a few more lectures to our students at various levels, just to give a practical side. We have a number of practical lecturers here. Maria Nsomo, who was not able to come, and she has given her apologies. He himself has been a diplomat in many countries. So I think, but we want to engage very much between government and the government institutions that I think we are able to bring up the best diplomats that we can. So ours is to wish you all the best, wish you a wonderful career as a diplomat, and may the Lord continue blessing you that the sky is not the limit. Asante sana.